There is a moment happening right now, somewhere in the quiet machinery behind your eyes, where a piece of what you are experiencing is being filed away before you have even finished experiencing it. You do not notice this filing. You are not meant to. It happens the way your lungs fill and empty, without a single instruction from you, the way your heart finds its rhythm again after a startle, all without asking permission. Somewhere in a soft fold of tissue behind your temple, a comparison is quietly running, checking this instant against everything that came before it, sorting the new from the familiar, deciding, second by second, whether what you are living through right now has ever happened to you before. Most of the time, this comparison resolves so smoothly that you never feel it happen at all. You walk into your kitchen, and some part of you confirms, instantly and wordlessly, that yes, this is the same kitchen you left this morning, the same tilt of afternoon light across the counter, the same faint hum from the refrigerator. There is no drama in this confirmation. It arrives like breath, like blinking, like the small, unregistered adjustments your eyes make as a room grows dim. You are free to think about dinner, or a conversation from earlier, or nothing at all, because this quiet checking system has already done its work in the background, and it has told you, without fanfare, that everything here belongs to your ordinary continuous life. But every so often, for reasons that are still not entirely settled even among the people who have spent careers studying it, that checking system stumbles. Not badly, not in any way that would alarm you if you saw it from the outside. It simply hesitates, for a fraction of a second, over something that should be brand new and returns the wrong answer. It tells you, you have been here before. And you, sitting in a stranger's living room for the very first time, or standing at a crosswalk you have never crossed, or hearing a friend say a sentence they have never said to you until this exact instant, feel a small, cool ripple move through you, the unmistakable, oddly intimate sensation that this precise configuration of sound and light and feeling already happened once, somewhere, sometime, and you are simply living through it again. It is a strange kind of certainty and a strange kind of doubt, arriving together, because even as the feeling insists that this moment is a repeat, some other part of you, standing just behind it, knows perfectly well that it cannot be. You have never sat in this chair. You have never met this person before today. The math of your life does not allow for this specific arrangement of details to have occurred previously. And yet the feeling does not care about the math. It sits there, warm and undeniable, refusing to be talked out of itself even while you are actively telling yourself it is impossible. Two contradictory certainties present at once inside the same few seconds of ordinary time. If you have ever felt this, you know it rarely announces itself with any warning. There is no slow build, no gathering sense that something unusual is approaching. It tends to arrive the way a cold draft arrives through an old window frame, sudden and specific, there and then gone. One moment you are simply present, doing whatever ordinary thing you were doing, and the next moment, the present tense itself has gone slightly strange, has developed a kind of echo, as though you were watching your own life through a pane of glass that has been used once before and not quite wiped clean. And then, almost as quickly as it arrived, it dissolves, and you are back in the plain, unremarkable present, left holding nothing but the faint aftertaste of having briefly doubted what was real. People have tried, for a very long time, to put this sensation into words, and the words themselves tell you something about how slippery it is to describe. In French, the phrase means simply, already seen, a name so plain it barely counts as an explanation at all, more like a label stuck onto the outside of a locked box. Other languages have reached for it differently. In German, One old expression translates roughly to the sense that one has dreamed something before it happened, which points toward a very different and much larger question, one about whether the feeling has anything at all to do with foresight, with prophecy, with the mind somehow getting ahead of itself. That question, as it turns out, will occupy people for centuries, long before anyone had the tools to study the brain closely enough to look for a better answer. For most of human history, in fact, there was no better answer to reach for. If you felt this strange doubling of the present a few hundred years ago, you did not have access to a scientist who could show you a diagram of the temporal lobe, or explain how memory circuits sometimes fire out of their expected order. What you had instead were the explanations available to you through the culture around you, and those explanations tended to be large and dramatic, because the feeling itself is large and dramatic, even when the moment producing it is completely mundane. A person might wonder if they were catching a glimpse of a previous life, some flicker of a self they had been before this one, surfacing briefly through the surface of the present. Someone else might wonder if their soul had visited this exact scene already, in a dream they could no longer recall, and was simply recognizing its own earlier passage through it. These were not foolish explanations, not for the time they came from. When a sensation feels this vivid and this specific, and there is no framework available for talking about neurons or memory circuits, reaching for something larger than biology is a perfectly reasonable response. The feeling demands an explanation proportional to its strangeness, and for most of history, biology simply was not offering one. What is quietly remarkable, and worth sitting with for a moment, is how ordinary the experience turns out to be once you start asking people about it plainly, without any mystical framing attached. Ask almost any room full of adults whether they have ever felt this, and most hands will rise. It is not a rare gift belonging to a sensitive few, and it is not a symptom, in the vast majority of cases, of anything being wrong. It appears to be something closer to a normal, if uncommon, feature of an ordinary working mind, the kind of glitch that shows up in reliable systems everywhere, the way a perfectly good phone line will occasionally produce a small burst of static, the way a well-tuned radio will sometimes catch for half a second a stray signal bleeding in from some other frequency before settling cleanly back onto its station. The brain is not a flawless machine. It was never built to be one. It is a magnificent, improvising, constantly self-correcting system, stitching together your sense of the present moment out of memory, prediction, and raw sensation, all working in close, imperfect coordination. And every so often, in the space of that stitching, a seam shows. You may have felt this yourself at some point, that quiet, cool ripple, that momentary conviction that the present has happened before. You may have felt it recently, or long ago, or perhaps you are still waiting to notice it for the first time. Whichever is true for you, it is worth knowing, before we go any further into what might actually be happening in those brief seconds, that you are not imagining something broken. You are noticing, however faintly, a seam in a process that is running constantly beneath your awareness, checking the present against the past, trying its quiet best, moment after moment after moment, to tell you exactly where and when you are. And in a little while, we can start looking gently at what scientists, over the last century or so, have begun to understand about why that seam sometimes shows itself at all. So let us slow down, here in the dark, and do something that sounds simple but rarely gets done properly, which is to actually define the thing we are talking about. Because déjà vu, as a phrase, gets used loosely, almost carelessly, in everyday conversation, the way people say they are starving when they mean merely hungry, or say a movie was the best thing they have ever seen, when they mean only that they enjoyed it quite a lot on a Tuesday evening. Words stretch under casual use, and déjà vu has stretched further than most, so before we can look closely at what causes it, we need to gently pull it back into its proper shape. The term itself is French, and it means, quite plainly, already seen. It was given its name in the late 19th century by a French researcher named Émile Boirac, a philosopher with an interest in the odder corners of ordinary experience, who used the phrase in writing around 1876, though he would spend decades afterward refining his thinking about it. Before Boirac settled on those two words, other researchers had tried other names for what seemed to be the same experience, calling it promnesia or paramnesia, terms that never quite caught on the way his simple, almost domestic phrase did, already seen. Two small words, and yet they carry a very specific and quite narrow claim, one that is easy to lose sight of once the phrase becomes part of everyday speech. Here is the narrow claim. Déjà vu is not simply a feeling of familiarity. It is something sharper and stranger than that. When you feel ordinary familiarity, walking into a coffee shop you have visited many times, say, or hearing a song you have heard 100 times before, your mind is doing exactly what it is supposed to do. It is recognizing something correctly. It is matching present sensation against a real stored memory, finding the match, and telling you, accurately, yes, this belongs to something I have encountered before. That is recognition working properly. It is one of the quiet, essential jobs your memory performs for you, constantly, sorting new from known, letting you move through a familiar world without having to relearn it from scratch every single day. Déjà vu is not that. Déjà vu is the feeling of that exact recognition, that exact sense of having encountered something before, arising in a moment when, as far as you can tell, and as far as reason can confirm, there is no real prior encounter to be recognizing. You walk into a room you have never entered in your life, and something in you insists, with total conviction, that you have stood in this exact spot before, heard this exact sentence spoken, noticed this exact pattern of afternoon light falling across this exact stretch of floor. The feeling arrives with all the certainty of ordinary memory. It has the same emotional texture, the same sense of pastness, the same quiet authority that a real memory carries, and yet it is paired, almost immediately, with the awareness that this cannot be true. You know, even as you feel it, that you have not actually been here before. That pairing, that strange doubled awareness of feeling something is old, while knowing it must be new, is the essential and defining feature of the experience. Without both halves present together, it is not really déjà vu at all. It is something else, something we should also take a moment to name properly, because getting these distinctions clear will make everything we discuss later easier to follow, easier perhaps to simply let settle into you as you drift. Consider, for instance, a simpler and much more common cousin of déjà vu, something researchers sometimes call a feeling of knowing, or a simple sense of familiarity without the eerie edge. This happens constantly, and mostly without our noticing it as anything unusual. You meet someone at a gathering and think, quietly, I feel as though I know this person, perhaps we have met before, and then a moment later you realize, ah yes, they resemble a cousin of yours, or they have the same laugh as an old colleague, or you simply did meet them once, years ago, at some conference whose name has long since faded. This is ordinary partial recognition, memory doing its usual work but doing it incompletely, matching some features while leaving others unmatched, producing a mild, explainable puzzle rather than an uncanny one. It resolves. It has a source you can, with a little effort, usually track down. Déjà vu, by contrast, resists this kind of resolution. You cannot find the source, because most of the time there really is no earlier encounter to find. The two experiences can feel similar around the edges, but they are not the same animal. Then there is another relative, one with its own French name, Déjà vécu, meaning already lived, or already experienced. This is a much rarer and considerably more intense variant, associated in some cases with certain neurological conditions, in which a person does not simply feel a brief flicker that a moment has happened before, but becomes persuaded, sometimes for extended stretches of time, that an entire unfolding sequence of events is a repetition of something lived through previously, in exact detail. Where ordinary déjà vu lasts a few seconds and is accompanied by the clear, steady knowledge that it cannot be true, déjà vécu can be far more disorienting, sometimes accompanied by a real and troubling conviction that the repetition is genuine. It is important to say clearly, since we are lying here in the dark and precision matters more than drama, that déjà vécu is not what most people mean when they describe déjà vu, and it is not the ordinary, harmless experience that fills the rest of this account. It belongs to its own category, worth knowing about mostly so you can set it gently aside and not worry it might apply to you. There is also déjà rêvé, already dreamed, a somewhat less discussed cousin, describing the sense that a present waking moment matches something once dreamed, rather than something once lived. Some researchers treat this as a genuine and distinct experience in its own right, related to but not identical with déjà vu proper, since dreams themselves are such strange, half-formed sources of memory to begin with, full of fragments and feelings more than clear, orderly scenes. Others suspect that at least some cases people describe as déjà rêvé are simply déjà vu experiences that the person, searching for some explanation, has decided must trace back to a half-remembered dream, since dreams are among the few places we readily accept that strange, sourceless familiarity might legitimately come from. This uncertainty itself tells you something useful, which is that the boundaries between these related experiences are not always crisp, drawn with a fine, unambiguous line. They blur into one another at the edges, the way colors blur, where one shade of evening sky gives way softly to the next. And it is worth ruling out one more thing entirely, something that sounds like déjà vu but really is not, which is simple, ordinary repetition. If you eat lunch at the same restaurant every Thursday, and it feels familiar when you walk in, that is not déjà vu. That is just memory, working exactly as intended, matching real experience to real experience with no mystery attached at all. Genuine déjà vu requires that gap, that impossible seam, between the vivid feeling of prior experience and the near certainty that no such experience occurred. This is also, in part, why people describe déjà vu so differently from one another when you ask them about it, why one person's account can sound almost nothing like another's, despite both people confidently using the very same French phrase. Some describe it as a feeling centered entirely in the body, a kind of cool wave or a tightening low in the chest. Others describe it as almost purely cognitive, a thought more than a sensation, arriving without any accompanying physical signature at all. Some report it lasting only a heartbeat or two, gone before they can even turn their attention fully toward it, while others describe it stretching for what felt, to them, like 10 or 15 seconds, long enough to notice its shape clearly as it passed. Language itself may be partly responsible for some of this variation, since English borrowed a French phrase wholesale rather than developing its own native vocabulary for the experience, leaving people to describe a fairly precise inner event using words that were never built, in English, to carry that particular weight. But the differences run deeper than vocabulary alone, and that is really where our story gets interesting, because it suggests that déjà vu may not be one single uniform event happening the same way in every mind, but rather a family of related experiences arising from more than one route through the brain, each producing a broadly similar feeling from a slightly different set of underlying conditions. The phrase itself, déjà vu, meaning simply already seen, is younger than you might expect, and its arrival tells its own quiet story. It was not coined by a poet or a mystic, but by a French psychical researcher named Émile Boirac, who used it in writing near the end of the 1800s, sometime around 1876, though the term did not settle firmly into common use until a bit later, when Boirac published a book in 1917 that helped carry it into wider circulation. Before that, the experience certainly existed, because people have always had strange minds, but it drifted through the world without a single settled name to hold it steady. It went by other labels in other hands. Some called it promnesia, a word built to suggest memory running ahead of itself, arriving before its time. Others used paramnesia, a broader term for memory gone slightly sideways, which covered déjà vu alongside other odd tricks of recollection, some quite different from the eerie doubling we have been describing. There was also a phrase used by a British physician named Arthur Ladbroke Wigan, who in 1844 wrote about what he called the duality of the mind, proposing that the brain's two halves might sometimes fall very slightly out of step with each other, so that one hemisphere registers an experience a fraction of a second before the other does, and the second hemisphere, receiving what feels like an echo, mistakes that echo for an old memory rather than a fresh one. It is a lovely, careful piece of 19th century reasoning, built from what little was known at the time about the brain's two sides, and though it has not held up especially well against later evidence, it deserves credit for being one of the earliest attempts to locate the puzzle inside the physical machinery of the brain itself, rather than in the soul, or in fate, or in some other realm entirely outside of biology. And it is worth pausing here, gently, to notice that the impulse to explain déjà vu through the soul, through fate, through something outside biology, was in fact the older and more common impulse for a very long time, and in some circles still is. Long before anyone was writing about hemispheres and timing, the experience of encountering a new place or a new moment and feeling certain you had lived it before was often taken as a kind of evidence for reincarnation, for instance, the idea that the strange familiarity was actually a genuine memory, but one belonging to a previous life, surfacing briefly into this one before sinking back down out of reach. This was, and still is for some people, a deeply comforting explanation, because it turns a small cognitive glitch into something meaningful, a message rather than a misfire. It is not our purpose here to argue that this explanation is wrong, exactly, since questions of that kind sit outside what science can settle one way or the other. But it is worth naming clearly as a belief, held sincerely by many people across many centuries, distinct from the explanations that later researchers would try to test, measure, and support with evidence gathered from the brain itself. The two kinds of explanation, the spiritual and the scientific, were often tangled together in the writing of the era we are describing, and separating them out is part of what makes this history worth telling slowly. Long before Boirac gave the feeling its French name, individual writers had already been trying, in their own words, to pin the sensation down on paper, and their attempts are worth lingering over because they show us that the experience itself has felt remarkably consistent across a very long stretch of time, even while the explanations offered for it have shifted enormously. The philosopher and theologian Augustine of Hippo, writing many centuries earlier still, described something in his Confessions that some later scholars have connected to this same territory of experience, a strange, doubled sense of foreknowledge threaded through ordinary perception. Though we should be careful here, since Augustine was writing in Latin in a very different intellectual world, concerned with very different questions than we are, and it is easy to read our own modern vocabulary backward onto an old text in ways the original author never intended. Centuries after Augustine, in 1817, the novelist Sir Walter Scott wrote in his own journal about a sensation he called a sense of pre-existence, describing how, in company, a turn of conversation would sometimes strike him with the powerful and uncomfortable feeling that he had heard the very same words spoken by the very same people at some earlier point he could not place. Scott, characteristically, did not claim to know what caused it. He simply set the observation down, carefully, the way a naturalist might note an unusual bird, without pretending to explain the bird's biology. Charles Dickens, too, folded a description of the feeling into his fiction, giving it to the narrator of David Copperfield, who pauses in the middle of an ordinary scene to remark on the queer sense that he has said and done these very things before, at some indefinite past time, and that he knows exactly what will be said next, as though he suddenly remembered it. What is striking, reading these old accounts side by side, is how precisely they anticipate the language people still reach for today, more than 150 years later, the same emphasis on knowing what comes next, the same sense of a memory just barely out of reach, the same mixture of wonder and unease. The feeling, whatever its cause, does not seem to be a modern invention or a product of modern life's particular pressures and distractions. It appears to be something closer to a stable feature of the human mind, showing up in remarkably similar form across very different centuries, languages, and ways of living. By the time psychology was establishing itself as a formal discipline, toward the end of the 1800s and into the early 1900s, researchers began trying to move past mere description and toward something closer to explanation, though it is important to say plainly that most of what was proposed in this period remained speculative, built more on careful observation and reasoning than on the kind of controlled evidence later generations would come to expect. Sigmund Freud, for his part, offered an explanation rooted in his broader theory of the unconscious mind, suggesting that déjà vu might arise when a present moment unconsciously touches on some buried, half-forgotten memory, perhaps even a memory tied to an old daydream or an old wish, so that the feeling of recognition is real, in a sense, but pointing not toward an actual repeated event, only toward a repeated emotional theme. It is an interesting idea, characteristically Freudian in its emphasis on the unconscious and on emotional undercurrents running beneath the surface of ordinary experience. But like Wiggins' hemisphere theory before it, it was built largely from clinical impressions and careful listening to patients, rather than from anything approaching a controlled study, and later researchers would come to view it as one hypothesis among several, interesting but far from proven. Around this same period, in England, a group of researchers connected to the Society for Psychical Research, including a classical scholar named Frederick William Henry Myers, took a particular interest in cataloging accounts of déjà vu alongside other unusual mental experiences, collecting testimonies much as a naturalist might collect specimens, hoping that careful accumulation of detail would eventually reveal an underlying pattern. Myers and his colleagues were sincere, methodical people, and their instinct to gather many individual accounts before attempting any grand theory was, in its own way, ahead of its time, an early gesture toward the kind of evidence-based thinking that would come to define psychology later on. But the tools available to them were limited to what a person could report about their own inner experience, since there was, as yet, no way to look inside a living, thinking brain and watch what was actually happening there in the moment the feeling arose. That particular window, the one that would eventually let researchers move from careful listening toward something closer to direct observation, would not open for several more decades still, and when it finally did open, it would open in an operating room, of all places, through the unlikely work of a surgeon holding a small electrode to the exposed surface of a patient's brain. That patience, waiting for the science to catch up to the phenomenon, is worth sitting with for a moment, because it points toward a distinction that had not yet been clearly drawn in Myers's day, but which turns out to sit close to the heart of why déjà vu feels the way it does. That distinction is the difference between recollection and familiarity, and though the two words might sound almost interchangeable in ordinary conversation, memory researchers have come to treat them as genuinely separate processes produced by different mechanisms in the brain, capable of operating independently of one another, sometimes even pulling in opposite directions at once. Think for a moment about what actually happens when you recognize someone. Imagine you are standing in a grocery store, reaching for a box of tea, and someone passes you in the aisle and says your name. There is a flicker of recognition, and then, almost instantly, one of two very different things tends to happen. In the first case, a whole scene unfolds behind your eyes. You remember, this is the person who sat 2 seats away from you in a college seminar. You remember the professor's slow, deliberate way of speaking. You remember a specific rainy Tuesday when the two of you argued cheerfully about a reading assignment over vending machine coffee. The memory arrives with texture, with context, with a place and a time attached to it, almost like pulling a specific book off a specific shelf and being able to open it to the right page. That is recollection. It is effortful, in its own quiet way, and specific, and it comes bundled with details that let you locate the memory precisely in your personal history. But sometimes what happens instead is quite different. The person says your name, and you know, with complete confidence, that you know them. Your body even responds appropriately. You smile, you say hello, you speak with the easy warmth of familiarity, and yet nothing else comes. No seminar, no professor, no rainy Tuesday. Just a bare, undeniable sense of knowing, floating free of any actual memory to justify it. You might spend the rest of your shopping trip quietly turning the question over, trying to figure out where you know this person from, sometimes succeeding only later, in the shower or on the drive home, when the context finally surfaces on its own. That bare sense of knowing, without any accompanying content, is familiarity, and the important thing, the thing memory researchers have spent decades demonstrating through careful experiments, is that familiarity is not simply a weaker or incomplete version of recollection. It appears to be its own distinct process, running on what seems to be a partially separate track in the brain, capable of firing on its own, without any recollection ever arriving to back it up. This idea has a history of its own, quieter and less dramatic than the story of Freud or Wigan, but no less important. Through the middle of the 20th century, memory researchers had mostly treated recognition as a single, unified experience, something you either had or did not have, on or off, like a light switch. It was psychologists working later in the century, people like George Mandler, whose careful experiments on recognition memory in the 1980s helped make the case that recognition was not one process, but at least two, working in tandem under ordinary circumstances, but separable under the right conditions. Around the same period, researchers such as Larry Jacobi developed clever experimental methods designed specifically to pull recollection and familiarity apart from one another in the laboratory, showing that a person's sense of having encountered something before could be manipulated somewhat independently of their ability to recall any actual details about the encounter. And running alongside this work was the influential thinking of Endel Tolving, the Estonian-born, Canadian-based psychologist who in the early 1970s had proposed a distinction between what he called episodic memory, memory for specific personal experiences tied to a particular time and place, and semantic memory, general knowledge and facts stripped of that personal context. Tolving's framework was not identical to the recollection and familiarity distinction, but it grew from the same underlying intuition that memory is not one single faculty, but a collection of related systems, each doing somewhat different work, each capable of being damaged or altered somewhat independently of the others. What all of this careful, patient research adds up to, for our purposes tonight, is a simple but useful idea. The feeling of having experienced something before, that warm, specific glow of recognition, does not always require an actual memory underneath it. Familiarity can rise up on its own, triggered by something in the current moment, without recollection ever showing up to explain where that familiarity came from. Under ordinary circumstances, this rarely causes any trouble, because familiarity and recollection tend to arrive together, like two musicians who have played together so long they no longer think about staying in time with one another. You see an old friend, and the sense of knowing them and the specific memories of them arrive in the same breath, so closely bound together that you never notice they were separate processes at all. But every so often, something in the timing goes slightly wrong. The familiarity signal fires, strong and confident, announcing that this moment, this room, this exact configuration of sound and light and conversation has happened before. And recollection, the part of the mind responsible for actually locating a matching memory, for pulling the right book off the right shelf, comes up empty. There is nothing there. No seminar, no rainy Tuesday, no specific event anywhere in your personal history that this feeling can be pinned to. And it is precisely this mismatch, a loud, confident signal of familiarity, paired with a complete absence of any retrievable memory to justify it, that many memory researchers now suspect lies close to the center of what déjà vu actually is. Picture, if it helps, a smoke detector mounted on a kitchen ceiling. Its entire job is to sound an alarm when it senses something burning. Almost always when it goes off, there really is smoke, from a pan left too long on the stove, from bread forgotten in the toaster, and the alarm and the cause line up neatly, the way familiarity and recollection usually line up neatly. But smoke detectors can also be fooled. Steam from a hot shower, a bit of dust, disturbed during a vacuuming, and the alarm sounds anyway, insistent, certain, utterly convinced that something is burning, even though nothing is. You stand there under the shrieking noise, looking around the kitchen, finding no fire anywhere, and the very absence of any visible cause only makes the blaring alarm feel stranger, more insistent, more unsettling than if you had simply seen smoke and known exactly what to do about it. Déjà vu may work something like that. A signal of familiarity fires, urgent and specific, insisting this has all happened before, while the part of the mind that would normally supply the matching memory, the actual fire, so to speak, finds nothing at all, and the mind, unable to simply dismiss its own alarm the way you might shrug off a jumpy smoke detector, is left standing in the strange position of trusting a feeling it cannot explain. This also helps make sense of something that puzzles most people who experience déjà vu, which is the peculiar quality of certainty that accompanies it. It rarely feels like a vague hunch. It feels, in the moment, almost aggressively confident, more sure of itself than most ordinary memories manage to be. That intensity may itself be a clue about where in the brain this misfire is originating, and about which particular structures are responsible for generating that unusually forceful signal of familiarity in the first place. A question that researchers would eventually be able to investigate far more directly than Myers or his contemporaries ever could, once they finally found a way to listen in on the living brain itself, one small region at a time. The story of how researchers began listening in on the brain starts, unusually enough, in the 1880s, with a British neurologist named John Huglings Jackson, who spent his career studying patients with epilepsy long before anyone had the tools to see inside a living skull. Jackson noticed that some of his patients, in the seconds before a seizure took hold, described a strange and specific warning. They called it a dreamy state, a sudden and overwhelming sense that the present moment had already happened, mixed with a kind of detached unreality, as though they were watching their own lives from a slight distance. Jackson suspected, correctly as it turned out, that these dreamy states originated somewhere in the temporal lobes, the regions tucked behind the temples on either side of the head. He had no way to confirm this directly. He could only listen to what his patients told him, compare their accounts, and notice that the pattern kept pointing to the same general neighborhood of the brain, the way a detective might notice that every witness keeps glancing toward the same street corner without quite being able to say why. It would take the better part of a century before anyone could do more than listen. In the 1930s and 1940s, a neurosurgeon named Wilder Penfield, working at the Montreal Neurological Institute, began operating on patients with severe epilepsy, the kind that medication could not control. Because the brain itself feels no pain, Penfield could keep these patients awake during surgery, their skulls open, and touch the exposed surface of their brains with a small electrode while asking them, quite simply, what they felt. It was extraordinary and slightly eerie work. A touch in one spot might make a patient's hand twitch without their willing it. A touch in another might conjure the smell of burnt toast, or a fragment of music from childhood, arriving unbidden and startlingly vivid. And occasionally, though rarely enough that Penfield could never turn it into a reliable rule, a touch somewhere in the temporal lobe would produce exactly what Jackson's patients had described decades earlier, a rush of certainty that this exact moment, the operating room, the voices, the electrode's touch, had all happened before. It was tantalizing evidence, but frustratingly inconsistent. Different patients responded to different spots. Some felt nothing at all. Penfield had found a neighborhood, not an address. It has taken modern techniques to narrow things down further, and even now, the picture that has emerged looks far more like a small committee of overlapping structures than a single switch waiting to be flipped. Some of the most useful evidence has come, again, from patients with epilepsy, this time from a technique called stereo EEG, in which doctors implant thin electrodes deep into the brain itself, not just resting on its surface, but threaded down into folds and pockets that Penfield could never have reached, all in the effort to locate precisely where a patient's seizures begin before attempting surgery. This gives researchers something close to Penfield's old experiment, but with far greater precision. The electrode's tip resting directly against structures with names like the hippocampus, the entorhinal cortex, and the perirhinal cortex, all clustered together in the medial temporal lobe, all involved in memory, and all, it turns out, doing rather different jobs. The hippocampus, curled and seahorse-shaped, deep in the temporal lobe, works something like a very thorough clerk. Its job, broadly speaking, is to bind together the separate threads of an experience, the sight of a room, the sound of a particular voice, the time of day, the emotional flavor of the moment, and stitch them into a single retrievable memory, tagged with enough context that later you can locate not just the fact that something happened, but where it happened, and roughly when, and who else was there. This is what memory researchers sometimes call recollection, and it tends to come with detail attached, the way pulling one thread from a well-organized filing cabinet brings the whole folder along with it. The perirhinal cortex sits nearby, wrapped along the underside of the temporal lobe, and seems to do something narrower and, in a sense, cruder. It appears to specialize in a stripped-down signal of familiarity, a simple sense of having encountered something before, stripped of the contextual detail that the hippocampus usually supplies. Psychologists studying ordinary memory have long noticed this same split in how people describe their own recall, sorting their memories into two rough categories: ones they can consciously remember, complete with surrounding detail, and ones they merely know, in the sense that a fact or a face feels correct, without any accompanying story attached to it. You might recognize a face in a grocery store with total confidence, know absolutely that you have seen this person before, and yet be unable to say where, or when, or in what context, the name and the story simply refusing to surface. That gap between knowing and remembering maps rather neatly onto the gap between what the perirhinal cortex seems to provide and what the hippocampus seems to provide, and it offers a much more precise version of the smoke alarm idea from a moment ago. It suggests exactly which detector might be the one going off. If the perirhinal cortex generates a jolt of raw familiarity, and if, for whatever reason, that signal fires without the hippocampus supplying its usual accompanying record of context, you would expect precisely what déjà vu feels like from the inside, an overwhelming sense that this has happened before, with absolutely nothing behind it to say when or where or how. The alarm sounds, insistent and specific, and the filing cabinet that should hold the matching folder turns out to be empty. Nearby, the entorhinal cortex acts as something like a switching station, a narrow gateway through which nearly all the traffic between the hippocampus and the rest of the cortex has to pass, funneling incoming sensory information toward the hippocampus for binding and sending processed memories back out again. A very brief hiccup at that gateway, a delay of only a fraction of a second in one direction while everything else proceeds on schedule, could in principle be enough to make current experience and the neural echo of that experience arrive at their destination out of step, close enough together to blur into one, the mind unable to tell that it is comparing a moment against itself rather than against a proper memory from the past. None of this proves that déjà vu works this exact way in every case, and it is worth saying plainly that most of the direct evidence comes from people with epilepsy, whose brains, however carefully studied, are not perfectly representative of everyone else's. A seizure is a large, synchronized storm of electrical activity, visible and measurable, while an ordinary bout of déjà vu in someone without epilepsy is presumably something much smaller, a brief and local flicker rather than a storm, if indeed the two share any real mechanism at all. Researchers have been careful, on the whole, not to claim more certainty than the evidence supports. What they have instead is a set of clues, gathered from very different vantage points, that keep pointing toward the same general region and the same general kind of process, familiar circuitry misfiring in a small, specific, and temporary way. The hippocampus, the perirhinal cortex, the entorhinal cortex, the wider temporal lobe, none of them acting as a single switch that simply turns déjà vu on, but each of them a piece of a network capable, under just the right circumstances, of momentarily disagreeing with itself about what has and has not already happened. And once researchers had this rough map in hand, however incomplete, they naturally wanted to know whether they could test it, not just in patients undergoing brain surgery, but in ordinary people, sitting quietly, half asleep, in an ordinary laboratory chair. Long before anyone could watch a living brain in the act of misfiring, before electrodes and scanners existed at all, thinkers were already trying to explain déjà vu by imagining two signals instead of one. The idea has a surprisingly long pedigree. In the early 1920s, the American psychologist Edward Titchener, working at Cornell, proposed something almost embarrassingly simple, and yet it has aged rather well. He suggested that déjà vu might come from a kind of accidental doubling of ordinary perception, a moment split into two glances rather than one. Picture someone walking down a street, glancing briefly at a shop window, their attention elsewhere, thinking about something else entirely, so that the glance barely registers. Then, a half-second later, they look again, properly this time, taking the window in fully. To the conscious mind, only the second glance seems to exist, because the first one was too brief and too unattended to leave behind anything but the faintest trace. But that faint trace is still there, filed away somewhere, and when the second, fuller look arrives, it collides with the shadow of the first. The result feels like recognition, because in a very small and literal sense, it is recognition. The person really has seen this scene before. They simply saw it a second and a half ago, not a lifetime ago, and the gap was too brief for them to notice consciously at all. Titchener's version was a psychological idea more than a neurological one, built on introspection and careful reasoning rather than instruments, but it planted a seed that would grow in a more physiological direction decades later. In the 1960s, a researcher named Robert Efron, working on entirely different questions about how the brain processes sound, proposed that auditory information might travel through the temporal lobe along two separate pathways rather than one, arriving at slightly different times, with the brain then working to knit the two arrivals into a single, seamless perception. Efron was not thinking about déjà vu when he proposed this. He was interested in a different and rarer problem, the way some people with certain neurological conditions seem to experience sound as fractured or doubled, as if hearing the same word twice in quick succession. But his dual pathway idea, once it existed, was hard for other researchers to resist borrowing. If two pathways carrying essentially the same information could exist and could occasionally fall out of step, then perhaps this was not a special feature of hearing alone. Perhaps something similar happened more broadly, across other kinds of perception, and perhaps déjà vu was what it felt like from the inside when that small, ordinary asynchrony grew. Just once, just briefly, slightly larger than usual. It is worth sitting with the shape of this idea for a moment, because it is genuinely elegant, the kind of explanation that has the pleasing symmetry of something almost too tidy to be entirely wrong. Imagine two couriers sent out from the same office, carrying identical copies of the same letter, both walking the same route toward the same recipient. Normally, they arrive close enough together that it makes no difference. The letter simply gets delivered. End of story. But suppose one courier trips on a loose paving stone, just once, just for a second, and arrives slightly behind the other. Now the recipient gets the same letter twice, moments apart, and for an instant might wonder whether they are somehow already familiar with news they are only now receiving. Nothing about the letter's content has changed, only its timing has slipped, and that slip is enough to produce a small, strange sense of having encountered this exact information before. Applied to the brain, The theory suggests that ordinary perception may not be a single, unified stream, so much as several streams running in close parallel, one perhaps handling the raw sensory data as it arrives, another perhaps routing that same data through deeper structures, like the hippocampus, for contextual binding, for stitching a scene together with a sense of place and time and meaning. Under normal conditions, these streams stay close enough in step that the brain never has to think about the difference between them at all. The same way a person watching television rarely notices that the sound and picture are ever so slightly separate signals being reassembled for them behind the scenes. But if one of these internal streams lags, even by a fraction, most people would never notice under any other circumstance. The later arrival might land not as new information, but as an echo of something the brain believes it has already processed. The present moment ends up, in effect, being compared against a very recent copy of itself, dressed up by the brain's normal recognition machinery to look like an old memory instead of a doubled instant. There is something in this account that fits neatly with what people describe when they talk about déjà vu. It explains the extraordinary briefness of the sensation, since a timing gap of this kind would presumably be measured in milliseconds, not minutes, which lines up with how quickly déjà vu arrives and dissolves, rarely lasting longer than the time it takes to notice it at all. It offers a plausible reason why déjà vu tends to show up more often during states associated with fatigue, with stress, with certain medications, with the drowsy edge of sleep itself, all conditions known to affect the timing and synchrony of neural activity more broadly, even if the details of how remain fuzzy. And it connects comfortably with the seizure research, since a temporal lobe seizure is, among other things, a dramatic disruption of the brain's normal electrical timing, a storm that could very plausibly knock two otherwise cooperative pathways out of alignment with each other, at least for the handful of seconds the seizure lasts. But the theory has real gaps, and it is worth naming them honestly rather than letting the tidiness of the analogy paper over them. The most basic problem is that nobody has ever actually measured this proposed delay happening in an ordinary person experiencing ordinary déjà vu. The idea remains, in a very literal sense, a story about what might be going on beneath an experience that is too brief, too unpredictable, and too private to catch in the act. Researchers cannot simply ask a volunteer to have déjà vu on command inside a scanner, and the handful of studies that have tried to provoke something like it under laboratory conditions have produced feelings that resemble déjà vu only loosely, without the full, specific, almost eerie certainty that people describe from real life. There is also a deeper conceptual weakness. Simply saying that a signal was delayed does not, by itself, explain why the brain would misinterpret that delay as memory rather than as something else entirely, a stutter, a glitch, a brief moment of confusion with no particular meaning attached. The theory needs the brain's recognition system to actively misread the second, later signal as evidence of a prior encounter, and that extra interpretive step, the leap from mere timing mismatch to full-blown certainty of having lived this moment before, is not something the timing story alone accounts for. It borrows that part from elsewhere, from theories about how recognition and familiarity actually work, which is really a separate question with its own separate history. Nor does dual pathway timing explain some of the odder details people report, the sense that déjà vu happens more to certain kinds of people than others, more often to younger adults than to older ones, more often to people who travel widely or read a great deal or dream vividly, patterns that seem to point toward something more like personality or cognitive style than a simple hardware delay that should, in principle, affect nearly everyone in roughly the same way. If timing alone were the whole story, It is not obvious why a well-traveled 25-year-old should experience these small internal echoes so much more often than a homebound person twice their age, since both, presumably, have temporal lobes built along the same basic plan. That gap between the tidiness of the timing explanation and the messiness of who actually reports déjà vu, and how often, is part of what has kept researchers looking elsewhere as well, toward a rather different question. Not when the signals of memory arrive, but what, exactly, one particular signal is trying to say in the first place, and whether it might simply be wrong. One place that question leads is toward attention itself, and specifically toward what happens when attention is split rather than whole. Most of us assume, without ever quite examining the assumption, that we either notice a scene or we do not. That perception is something like a light switch, on or off, present or absent. But attention rarely works that way. It is closer to a beam that can widen or narrow, brighten or dim, and very often it does several of these things within the same handful of seconds without our being aware of the shift at all. Picture walking into a kitchen while thinking about something else entirely, a conversation from earlier in the day, a decision still unresolved, the small nagging question of whether you left the stove on somewhere else. Your eyes are open, light is entering them. The kitchen is, in every technical sense, being seen, and yet a good portion of your attention is elsewhere, occupied with that internal conversation, so that the room registers only faintly, a kind of background hum of visual information rather than a scene you are actually studying. This matters because the brain does not require full, focused attention in order to process a place. It can take in quite a lot, working almost entirely in the margins, cataloging shapes and colors and spatial relationships without ever pulling that information into the bright center of conscious awareness. Researchers who study attention sometimes describe this as processing without registration, meaning the information goes in, gets handled, even gets filed away somewhere, but never quite makes it to the part of the mind that would later say, "Yes, I remember seeing that." It is a little like a librarian who shelves a book correctly, following the numbering system, placing it exactly where it belongs, but who is thinking about something else the entire time and could not later tell you the book's title if you asked. The book is there, it is properly filed, and yet no memory of encountering it was ever formed, because the librarian's attention, in the moment that mattered, was somewhere else. Now imagine you walk back into that same kitchen a few minutes later, this time with your full attention present, no longer distracted by the earlier conversation, actually looking at the room. What you experience is strange, because the room now feels intensely, specifically familiar, and yet you cannot locate any memory of having seen it before. This is not quite the same thing as the delay theories from a moment ago, where the concern was about timing between two hemispheres or two processing streams. Here, the concern is about depth of attention, about how much of the room actually made it into memory the first time, and in what form. The first pass through the kitchen left behind something, a trace, a rough shape, but it left behind a trace that never became a full, retrievable memory, one you could consciously point back to and say, "There, that is where I saw this before." So the second pass produces recognition with no attached source. The feeling of having encountered this exact scene fires normally, because on some level you genuinely did encounter it. But the part of the mind responsible for saying when and where that encounter happened comes up empty, because that information was never properly recorded to begin with. The result is a recognition signal floating free of its own history, which is very close to how people actually describe déjà vu when they try to put it into words. Not a false feeling exactly, but a true feeling attached to nothing they can find. This idea gains a certain extra plausibility once you start thinking about how rooms and scenes are actually built, and how much of any given room is, in a structural sense, borrowed from every other room of its kind. Kitchens tend to share features because kitchens are built to solve the same small set of problems. Water needs to reach a sink, heat needs to reach a stove, storage needs to be within arm's reach of a counter, and so the results, across wildly different houses and decades and countries, end up rhyming with one another more than we tend to notice. A doorway positioned to the left of a window, a counter running along one wall with cabinets above it, a table set at a certain angle to catch the light. None of these individual features is memorable on its own, and none of them, by itself, would make anyone feel a jolt of déjà vu. But the brain does not only store individual features, it also stores something more like a layout, a rough map of how the pieces of a space relate to one another, and it is entirely possible to have stored dozens of these layouts across a lifetime, from friends' houses, from waiting rooms, from a hotel visited once on a trip years earlier, without ever consciously cataloging any of them as a specific, nameable memory. So when you step into a new room whose layout happens to closely echo one of those old, unlabeled maps, something curious can happen. The overall spatial pattern gets matched, even though none of the individual details do. It is a bit like recognizing a piece of music not because you remember any particular note, but because the melody's shape, its rise and fall, its rhythm, matches something buried in you from years before, a tune half heard on a radio in another room, never learned on purpose, never sung along to, and yet unmistakably familiar the moment it starts again. The room feels like somewhere you have been, and in a strange, partial, structural sense, you have, or at least somewhere enough like it that the difference does not register at the level where familiarity gets generated. What is missing is not a name for that resemblance, because names are not usually how spatial memory works, but rather any conscious record of the earlier place at all. The layout was absorbed and stored the way the kitchen's details were absorbed while your attention was elsewhere, present in the system without ever having been noticed as an event worth remembering. There is something worth sitting with in how ordinary the pieces of this explanation are on their own. Divided attention is not exotic. Nearly everyone spends large parts of an average day only half attending to the physical space around them, thinking about a phone call, a worry, a plan for later, while their eyes and ears go on quietly doing their job regardless. And overlapping room layouts are not exotic either, given how architecture repeats itself, how furniture gets arranged according to a fairly narrow set of practical logics, how a hallway leading to a bedroom tends to resemble other hallways leading to other bedrooms, far more than any of us tend to consciously register. Put those two ordinary facts together, a mind that stores more than it notices, and a world that repeats its own shapes more than it seems to, and you get the raw material for a feeling that seems, from the inside, wildly extraordinary. Not because anything paranormal or even especially unusual has occurred, but because the seams between partial memory, unattended processing, and structural resemblance are, by their very nature, invisible to the person experiencing them. You cannot feel the difference between a fully absent memory and a memory that exists but cannot be located, and so both end up producing the same unsettling sensation, the sense of a moment arriving twice. There is, though, still a further layer to this puzzle, one that has less to do with rooms and layouts, and more to do with something smaller and stranger, the way a single object, a particular arrangement of a few ordinary things on a table or a shelf, can sometimes trigger the same feeling on its own, without any surrounding scene involved at all, which raises the question of what the smallest possible unit of this kind of false familiarity might actually be. If you have ever wondered whether a scientist has simply sat someone down and tried to manufacture déjà vu on demand, the answer is yes, and the story of those attempts is quietly fascinating, partly because of what they accomplished, and partly because of how much they could not. The most direct approach, and probably the one that feels most intuitive if you imagine designing such a study yourself, involves virtual reality. Researchers led by Anne Cleary, working at Colorado State University in the years after 2010, built a set of virtual scenes using a video game engine, ordinary-looking spaces, a garden, a junkyard, a room with furniture arranged just so. The trick was structural. Some scenes shared a layout with an earlier scene a participant had already explored. The placement of objects and pathways mapped onto the same underlying spatial arrangement, even though the specific objects and setting were completely different. A person might walk through a virtual barber shop and, later, walk through a virtual campsite that was arranged, invisibly, along the exact same floor plan, and a striking number of people, on entering the second scene, reported the unmistakable sensation of having been there before, even while knowing perfectly well they had not. This was a real result, carefully measured, and it lent strong support to the very idea you were just considering, that spatial layout alone, stripped of any specific content, can be enough to trigger the feeling. It also let researchers do something spontaneous déjà vu never allows, which is to watch the feeling arrive in real time, with a stopwatch running and a questionnaire ready. But even Cleary's own findings point toward the limits of this kind of work. The feeling her participants described was usually softer than what people report from their own spontaneous episodes, more like a flicker of oddness than the full, disorienting wave that makes someone stop mid-sentence and say, "Wait, this has happened before." Some participants felt nothing unusual at all, even when the hidden layout match was present, and, critically, nobody in these experiments experienced the second half of déjà vu that makes it so memorable outside the lab, that eerie conviction, arriving alongside the familiarity that you can almost predict what happens next. In a virtual garden with a matched layout, people felt a sense of having seen it, but almost never felt as though they knew what was about to happen a moment later. That second ingredient, the premonitory shiver, seems to resist being summoned by architecture alone. There is an older and stranger set of experiments involving hypnosis, dating back further, into the early and middle 20th century, when researchers were experimenting rather freely with what a hypnotic suggestion could implant. The logic here was almost theatrical. If part of déjà vu comes from a mismatch between what a person consciously remembers and what some part of their mind has actually processed, then you should be able to build that mismatch on purpose. A hypnotist could show a subject an object, suggest under hypnosis that all memory of having seen it be erased, and then, once the subject was brought out of the trance, present the object again. Some subjects, under these conditions, reported that unmistakable itch of prior exposure, that sense of having seen this before without being able to say when. It was a clever design because it isolated the essential structure of déjà vu, a memory trace present without a consciously accessible source, and produced something recognizably similar to the everyday experience. Yet this approach carries its own complications, and later researchers have been more cautious about how much weight to put on it. Hypnotic suggestibility varies enormously between people, and what a highly suggestible person reports under hypnosis is not necessarily proof of the same mechanism operating in everyday life. There is also the harder problem of demand characteristics, the possibility that a subject who has just been told, in effect, that something strange is about to happen to their memory might produce a report that matches the experimenter's expectation, whether or not anything resembling ordinary déjà vu has actually occurred inside their mind. So while the hypnosis studies are suggestive, in both senses of that word, they have never been considered a clean replication of the real phenomenon. More recent laboratory work has tried a quieter, more measurable route, using word lists and recognition tasks rather than immersive scenes or trance states. In this style of study, going back to work by Larry Jacoby and Kevin Whitehouse in the late 1980s, and refined many times since, participants are shown a list of words, sometimes under conditions of divided attention, glancing at the words while doing something else, so that the words are processed without being fully noticed, in miniature exactly the kind of half-attention we were considering with the hallway and the kitchen. Later, participants see a second list and are asked, word by word, whether each one is new or old. Certain words are secretly flashed very briefly beforehand, too quickly for conscious recognition, but long enough to leave a trace, so that when the same word appears again moments later, it feels processed more easily, more fluently than it should. And participants in these conditions do, reliably, report a sense that some new words feel oddly familiar, occasionally even insisting they must have seen a word before when the experimental record shows they could not have. What these word list experiments are good at is isolating one very specific mechanism, the fluency mechanism, the idea that ease of processing alone can be misread by the mind as a signal of past encounter. They are precise, repeatable, and statistically clean in a way virtual reality and hypnosis studies are not. But a printed word flashing on a screen is a thin, brittle little event compared to standing in a room, smelling coffee, hearing a particular pattern of rain against a window, feeling your body positioned at a certain angle relative to a doorway. The feeling these experiments produce, when it appears at all, tends to be described by participants in muted terms, a mild sense that a word seems to ring a bell, rather than the fuller uncanny experience the term déjà vu was coined to describe. It is something like comparing a single violin note played in a soundproofed room to the very concept of a symphony. The note may share a real underlying mechanism with the symphony, may even be a genuine ingredient of it, but it is not the same experience, and no amount of careful tuning quite closes that gap. This gap between laboratory results and lived experience is, in a sense, the central honest finding of this entire line of research. Every method, the layout matching in virtual environments, the induced amnesia under hypnosis, the subliminal priming with words, succeeds at producing something in the neighborhood of déjà vu, a genuine flicker of unearned familiarity, verified and measured under controlled conditions. And every method also falls short of the complete, multidimensional jolt that a person describes after the fact. The vivid, almost cinematic certainty, the sense of time folding briefly on itself. Spontaneous déjà vu seems to require an alignment of factors that a laboratory, by its nature, has trouble assembling all at once. Real emotional stakes, a body moving unself-consciously through unstaged space, attention genuinely divided by something in a person's actual life rather than divided by an experimental instruction, and a nervous system that is not, on some level, aware it is being watched. Which perhaps says less about any failure of these experiments and more about the peculiar, irreproducible texture of ordinary consciousness itself, the way certain experiences seem to depend on not being deliberately staged and slip quietly out of reach the moment somebody tries to build a stage for them at all. There is, however, one setting where something resembling déjà vu shows up not as a fleeting laboratory flicker, but as a repeatable, almost on-demand event, and that setting is the operating room, or more precisely, the neurosurgery suite of a hospital sometime in the middle of the 20th century, where a Montreal-based surgeon named Wilder Penfield was mapping the living brains of patients undergoing surgery for severe epilepsy. Because the brain itself contains no pain receptors, patients could remain awake during these procedures, calmly conversing with the surgical team while their skull lay open under bright lights. And this strange, humane circumstance allowed Penfield to do something that had never really been possible before. He could touch a mild electrical probe to the exposed surface of a patient's temporal lobe, the region tucked roughly behind the ear, and simply ask the patient what they were experiencing, in real time, as it happened. What some patients reported, when the current reached certain spots, was startling. Not pain, not a flash of light, but memory, or something that felt indistinguishable from memory. One patient described suddenly experiencing herself back in her kitchen, listening to her son playing in the yard, complete with the specific quality of the afternoon light and the sound of a particular voice. Another described the sensation of being at a family gathering that seemed to be happening again, right there on the table, stitched seamlessly into the ordinary sterile hum of the operating room. And, crucially, alongside some of these vivid pseudo-memories, a smaller number of patients described something closer to pure déjà vu, without any specific content attached to it at all, simply the conviction, sudden and complete, that whatever was happening to them right now had already happened before, in exactly this way, though they could point to no actual memory to justify the feeling. The current would move a few millimeters, the sensation would vanish, and the patient would return to reporting that everything felt perfectly, unremarkably new again. This was, and remains, one of the most direct pieces of evidence connecting déjà vu to a specific physical location in the brain. It suggested that at least some flavor of the feeling was not a philosophical puzzle floating free of biology, not purely a trick of language or memory theory, but something that could be triggered mechanically, the way pressing a particular key on a piano reliably produces a particular note, regardless of what the pianist happens to be thinking about that day. The temporal lobe, and in particular a set of structures nested inside it, the hippocampus, which helps form new memories, and the neighboring rhinal cortices, which seem to handle the sense that something is familiar, apart from any memory of the specific event that made it familiar, kept surfacing as the neighborhood where these sensations lived. It was as though the surgeons had found, almost by accident, a doorbell wired directly into whatever circuit produces the ordinary human sense that the present moment has been visited before. Penfield's original patients were not typical people having a typical day. Every one of them had a severe, treatment-resistant form of epilepsy, often with seizures originating in or near the temporal lobe, and it is worth sitting with that fact for a moment before drawing any conclusions from it, because it matters. A subset of people who live with temporal lobe epilepsy report that déjà vu, or something extremely close to it, arrives as an aura, a warning sensation that precedes a seizure by seconds, sometimes by slightly longer. For these individuals, the feeling of having already lived this exact moment is not a passing curiosity to mention over dinner. It is a signal, a kind of internal weather report, letting them know that a storm in their neural activity is beginning to gather, and that they may have a brief window to sit down, to move away from a staircase or a stove, to prepare for what is coming next. Some describe the déjà vu aura as accompanied by a rising sensation in the stomach, not unlike the drop of a fast elevator, or by a strange taste, or by a fleeting fear that arrives from nowhere and departs just as quickly once the seizure itself begins or, occasionally, once it passes without fully developing. It would be a mistake, though, and an unkind one, to let this connection blur into the idea that everyday déjà vu is itself a sign of illness, a kind of undetected seizure, rippling quietly through an otherwise healthy brain. That is not what the evidence shows, and it is worth being especially careful here, lying in the dark, letting these ideas settle. The vast majority of people who experience déjà vu, and most surveys suggest that is a strong majority of humanity at some point in a lifetime, have no seizure disorder whatsoever, no unusual electrical activity that any instrument has ever detected, nothing that a neurologist would look at twice. The déjà vu that visits an ordinary person waiting at a crosswalk, noticing the particular slant of afternoon light and feeling a hollow, wordless certainty that this exact configuration has occurred before, is by every available measure a different animal from the aura that warns a person with epilepsy of an oncoming seizure, even if the two experiences share a family resemblance, even if they may, at some deep level, involve overlapping neural circuitry doing something structurally similar. Think of it the way you might think of a common headache, and a headache caused by a serious underlying illness. Both are called by the same word. Both involve pain registering somewhere in the skull, and a doctor examining only the sensation itself, without any other information, might have real trouble telling one from the other in the first instant. But the ordinary headache that follows a long day of squinting at a screen, or too little water, or too little sleep, tells you almost nothing about the rare illness, and the rare illness does not mean that every ordinary headache is secretly dangerous. The word is shared. The underlying reality and the appropriate response are not. Déjà vu seems to work in something like the same way, a single label draped over what may actually be several related but distinguishable phenomena, tuned by circumstance, by health, by the peculiar wiring of a given brain on a given day. What makes the epilepsy research valuable, then, is not that it explains away déjà vu as a symptom to be worried about, but that it offers something rarer than a diagnosis. It offers a kind of accidental keyhole. Through the specific, unusual circumstances of awake brain surgery, and through the natural experiments that certain seizure disorders represent, researchers were able to glimpse, with unusual clarity, that the feeling of already having lived a moment can be produced by activity confined to a fairly specific patch of neural tissue, and that this activity can, under the right circumstances, become detached from any actual memory at all. That single observation, hard-won and strange, gathered from operating rooms and clinical case histories rather than from ordinary daydreaming minds, has done more than almost anything else to convince scientists that déjà vu, however mysterious it continues to feel from the inside, has a genuine physical address somewhere in the architecture of the brain. And knowing that there is an address, even one whose exact floor plan is still being sketched, changes the way a person might think about the sensation the next time it arrives, quietly, unannounced, in the middle of an entirely unremarkable afternoon. So let's turn to the ordinary conditions of life, the ones that have nothing to do with electrodes or operating rooms, and ask a simpler question. Who actually gets déjà vu, and when, and how often? This turns out to be one of the more carefully studied corners of the subject, if only because it is relatively easy to ask people, in large numbers, whether they have felt it, and roughly how frequently, and under what circumstances. And the answers, gathered patiently over decades of surveys, sketch a picture that is more modest, and honestly more interesting, than most of what circulates in casual conversation. Start with age, because it is one of the more reliable and least intuitive findings. You might expect déjà vu to become more common as a person accumulates more years, more memories, more raw material for something to feel eerily repeated. But the research points the other way. Déjà vu appears to peak in adolescence and early adulthood, roughly the late teens through the 20s, and then it grows gradually rarer as people move through midlife and into old age. A person in their 60s or 70s, on average, reports the experience considerably less often than a person in their 20s. This is almost the opposite of what folklore would predict. Folklore that tends to associate déjà vu with a kind of accumulated wisdom, a sense that the old soul has simply lived enough to start recognizing echoes. The data suggests something closer to a young nervous system doing something a little glitchy and self-correcting, a system still calibrating itself, still learning the difference between a new experience and a familiar one, and occasionally tripping over that distinction in a way that a more settled, more practiced brain does less often. Nobody knows precisely why this pattern holds, but it is a consistent enough finding, replicated across enough surveys and enough countries, that it deserves to be taken seriously, even while its explanation remains genuinely open. Fatigue and stress show up too, though here the evidence is a little softer, a little harder to pin down with confidence. People do commonly report that déjà vu seems to visit them more often when they are tired, when they have been working too hard, when sleep has been thin and stretched across too many nights. This lines up naturally enough with everything already said about memory and attention, because a tired brain is a brain running with less careful oversight, less capacity to keep its systems cleanly synchronized, more prone to the kind of small misfire that might let a feeling of familiarity leak out before the matching memory has actually been found. Stress, too, seems to correlate with more frequent reports, though stress is a slippery thing to measure and an even slipperier thing to separate from fatigue, since the two so often travel together, feeding each other, a stretch of anxious weeks eating into sleep, and thin sleep making everything feel more stressful in turn. What can be said honestly is that these correlations exist, gently, across multiple studies, without ever being dramatic or overwhelming. They are the kind of finding that nudges a scientific picture slightly in one direction rather than proving anything outright. A tired, stressed brain does not guarantee déjà vu, and plenty of déjà vu happens in people who are perfectly rested and calm. But the tilt in the data is there, small and consistent, like a slight lean in an old floor that you only notice if you set a marble down and watch which way it rolls. Travel belongs in this same modest category. Many people report that déjà vu seems more likely when they are in an unfamiliar place, moving through new streets, new rooms, new arrangements of light and furniture and doorways. This makes a certain intuitive sense if you think back to the pattern completion idea, the notion that déjà vu often arises when a new scene shares a hidden structural resemblance with something stored away and half forgotten. Travel puts a person in front of an enormous number of new scenes in a short span of time. Hotel corridors, unfamiliar kitchens, streets laid out at odd angles, and simply by volume, by sheer statistical exposure, some of those scenes are more likely to brush up against some fragment of memory from somewhere else. Another hotel, another kitchen, another street glimpsed once in childhood, and filed away without ever being consciously reviewed. Add to that the fatigue that so often accompanies travel, the jet lag, the disrupted sleep, the general fraying of a person's usual rhythms, and you have several plausible reasons layered on top of each other for why déjà vu might cluster more thickly around trips away from home. But notice the word plausible. Nobody has run the kind of tightly controlled experiment that would let a scientist say with real confidence that travel itself, as opposed to fatigue or novelty or simple attentiveness in an unfamiliar setting, is doing the causal work. The correlation is there in people's reported experience. The mechanism remains an educated guess. Dreams occupy a stranger corner of this landscape, because here the popular imagination runs far ahead of anything researchers can actually confirm. It is an extremely common belief, expressed by a great many ordinary people describing their own déjà vu, that the eerie familiarity comes specifically from having dreamed the scene beforehand, sometimes days or weeks earlier, sometimes so long before that the dream itself was never consciously recalled until the waking moment seemed to match it. This is a compelling story, and it fits neatly with how dreams already feel, fragmentary, half-remembered, full of settings that resemble real places without being identical to them. But it is worth being honest about how thin the actual evidence is here. There is no reliable way to test the claim, because by definition, it involves a dream that was not consciously remembered until after the déjà vu occurred, which means there is no independent record to check the memory against. A person feels the déjà vu, then reaches backward and constructs an explanation involving a half-glimpsed dream, and that explanation can feel completely convincing from the inside without there being any way to confirm or rule it out from the outside. Some researchers have speculated that this dream connection may simply be the mind's own storytelling instinct at work, the same instinct that makes any of us reach for a tidy explanation once we notice something strange, filling the gap with whatever material is close at hand, and dreams, murky and suggestible as they are, happen to be very convenient material. This does not mean the dream explanation is wrong in every case. It means it belongs, for now, in the category of things believed widely and tested poorly, worth holding loosely rather than repeating as settled fact. Imagination and a person's general tendency toward vivid, absorbed inner experience appear more solidly connected, at least in a mild statistical sense. People who score higher on measures of imaginative absorption, the capacity to get thoroughly lost in a book, a film, a daydream, to blur the edges between an internal world and the actual room around them, tend to report somewhat more frequent déjà vu than people who score lower on these same measures. This fits reasonably well with everything said earlier about memory retrieval being an active, reconstructive process rather than a simple playback. A mind that habitually builds rich, detailed internal scenes may simply have more raw material sitting in storage, more half-formed settings and faces and moods available to be dredged up mistakenly at the wrong moment. It may also be a mind more inclined to notice and dwell on the sensation once it arrives, rather than shrugging it off in the next half-second, the way a more literal-minded person might. Either way, the correlation is measurable, though modest, another gentle tilt in the data rather than a dramatic revelation. And running underneath all of these separate threads is a simple question of frequency, how often any of this actually happens across an ordinary life, which turns out to be its own small surprise worth sitting with for a moment. A small slice of déjà vu episodes, something like one in every 30 or 40 by the count of a handful of modest surveys, arrives with an extra passenger riding along. It isn't just the sense of having seen this room or heard this sentence before. It's a conviction, sudden and specific, that the person having the experience also knows what happens next. A word about to leave someone's mouth, a car about to turn the corner, a glass about to be set down on a particular spot on the table. This is where déjà vu stops being merely eerie and starts collecting the more dramatic stories, the ones people tell at dinner tables with lowered voices, the ones that get labeled precognitive rather than simply familiar. It is a small fraction of episodes, statistically speaking, but it is disproportionately the fraction that gets remembered, repeated, carried around for years as evidence of something larger than an ordinary evening. It's worth sitting with how convincing this feels from the inside, because it really can feel airtight. The sensation isn't vague. It doesn't announce itself as a hunch or a guess, the way a mild premonition might, soft and negotiable, easy to dismiss with a shrug. It arrives fully formed, as though a memory of the immediate future had somehow slipped backward into the present, and the person is now just watching it play out on schedule, the way you might watch a scene from a film you've already seen, waiting almost lazily for the line you know is coming. Anyone who has had this happen will tell you it is not a gentle suspicion. It is closer to certainty, the same flavor of certainty you have about your own name, or the shape of your own front door, something that doesn't require checking because it has never once been wrong before. Psychologists who study this have tried, patiently and a little skeptically, to find out whether the prediction is real or whether it only feels real after the fact. One approach, used by researchers including Anne Cleary and her colleagues, brings the mystery into something closer to a laboratory setting, which is a strange thing to imagine, given how private and involuntary the feeling usually is. Volunteers are led through simple virtual environments, walking down corridors and turning through mazes built from a limited set of components, so that some new scenes end up sharing a hidden layout with scenes from earlier in the session without anyone realizing it. A courtyard here shares its bones with a courtyard from 20 minutes ago. A hallway lined with doors on the left mirrors, in structure if not in decoration. A hallway walked through earlier under a different name. The participant has no way of knowing this. All they know is that something about turning this particular corner feels oddly, inexplicably familiar. When a participant hits one of these secretly similar scenes and reports the telltale prickle of déjà vu, researchers immediately ask a practical question. Which way does the corridor turn next? Left or right? It's a small, almost unglamorous test, sitting right in the middle of an otherwise dreamlike setup, but it's exactly the right test, because it takes the feeling of foreknowledge and asks it to actually perform. And here is the quietly deflating result. People who report déjà vu in that moment are not meaningfully better at guessing correctly than people who don't feel it at all. Their odds sit right around chance, the same as anyone flipping a mental coin. The sense of impending knowledge is vivid, but it does not translate into any measurable advantage at knowing the actual next step. The feeling of prediction, it turns out, can exist entirely apart from any real predictive accuracy, which is a strange thing for a feeling to do, and worth remembering the next time one shows up, quiet and insistent, in a hallway or a kitchen or the back seat of a car. None of this is a new puzzle, incidentally, even if the laboratory tools are new. People have been trying to explain the predictive flavor of déjà vu for well over a century, usually by reaching past ordinary memory altogether, out towards something larger and less provable. In the late 1800s, when the French philosopher Émile Boirac was assembling the vocabulary we still use today, coining the term déjà vu itself in 1876, the wider culture was deep in a fascination with spiritualism, seances, mesmerism, the idea that consciousness might not be as bounded by a single lifetime or a single skull as everyday experience suggested. Drawing rooms in London and Paris held gatherings where tables were said to tilt and knock, where mediums claimed to carry messages across some invisible boundary, and educated people who would never have described themselves as credulous sat in the dark and listened. Déjà vu fit that mood conveniently. If a scene felt already lived, perhaps it had been in some earlier existence, and the flash of recognition was the soul briefly remembering across the gap, a kind of echo arriving late from a life the conscious mind could no longer otherwise reach. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in London in 1882 by a group that included serious scientists alongside earnest believers, took reports like these seriously enough to investigate them formally, collecting testimonies, cross-referencing details, trying to apply something like scientific method to questions that mostly resisted it. Members corresponded with strangers across the country, asking them to write down déjà vu experiences in careful detail, comparing notes, looking for patterns the way a naturalist might look for patterns in the migration of birds. Reincarnation, prophetic dreaming, glimpses of a soul's earlier life, these explanations shared a certain emotional logic, even if they never quite held up under close inspection. They gave the overwhelming certainty of the moment somewhere dignified to go. A feeling that large seemed to deserve a cause that large in return, and a brief neural misfire in the temporal lobe, whatever that even meant to someone in 1885, seemed far too small and clinical an answer for something that felt like the universe folding briefly in on itself. The trouble is that human memory has its own, much less mystical way of manufacturing exactly this kind of certainty, and it does so constantly, in situations that have nothing to do with déjà vu at all. Consider what happens after any outcome becomes known. In perfectly ordinary life, far from any strange corridor or half-remembered room, a friend guesses which team will win a match, and afterward, whether they guessed right or wrong, their memory of how confident they felt beforehand tends to drift toward whatever actually happened. People who correctly picked the winner often remember themselves as having been quite sure all along, even if, in the moment, they hedged and mumbled something about how it could really go either way. Ask them a week later, and the hedge has quietly vanished from the story, replaced by something closer to conviction. This has a name in psychology, hindsight bias, and it was documented carefully by the researcher Baruch Fischhoff in a set of experiments in the mid-1970s. Fischhoff asked people to estimate the likelihood of various outcomes before those outcomes were known, then asked the same people, afterward, to recall what they had originally predicted. The recollections reliably shifted toward the actual result, not because anyone was lying, and not because anyone meant to deceive even themselves. The memory itself had been quietly edited, smoothed over, made to fit the story that made more sense now that the ending was known. It is a little like listening to a piece of music for the second time. Once you know the chord that resolves the phrase, it becomes almost impossible to remember how open and unresolved that same phrase sounded the very first time through, before you knew where it was going. It isn't hard to see how a similar kind of editing might attach itself to déjà vu. The experience already arrives, soaked in a feeling of prior knowledge, thanks to whatever mismatch in familiarity signals is happening underneath, the neural misfire discussed earlier that makes an unremarkable scene feel deeply, falsely recognized. Once that feeling is present, and once the moment unfolds in some ordinary way, a person's mind is perfectly capable of stitching the two together after the fact, quietly deciding that yes, this is what I knew was coming, this exact word, this exact turn of the head, this exact glass set down on this exact spot on the table. The prediction isn't checked in advance and confirmed, the way a weather forecaster's prediction gets checked against tomorrow's actual rainfall. It's assembled afterward, out of a feeling that was already there, and an outcome that has already happened. The same basic process Fischhoff found at work in people guessing sports scores, just wearing a stranger costume, dressed up in the particular eeriness that déjà vu specializes in. The mind isn't being dishonest here, it's doing what it always does, reaching for coherence, preferring a story where the pieces fit neatly together over one where a strange feeling and an ordinary event happen to occur near each other by chance, unrelated except for the accident of timing. This is, in the end, the quiet lesson sitting underneath all the dramatic reincarnation stories and predictive claims. A feeling of certainty, however total, however physically undeniable in the moment it arrives, is not the same thing as evidence that something actually happened before. The two get confused constantly, not because people are careless or gullible, but because certainty is generated by the same machinery, whether it is accurate or not. A false memory can feel exactly as convincing as a true one, indistinguishable from the inside, carrying no warning label. A retrofitted sense of having predicted something can feel exactly as convincing as an actual prediction would have felt, arriving with the same weight, the same specificity, the same total absence of doubt. The nervous system, it turns out, is not equipped with a separate dial that reads out how reliable a feeling is, no small gauge tucked somewhere behind the eyes that measures truth the way a thermometer measures heat. Confidence and correctness are produced by different processes entirely, running on separate tracks that simply happen to travel together, often enough that most of us never notice they've come apart, until an experiment like Cleary's quietly pulls them apart in a hallway that only exists inside a headset. Which leaves a gentler, more interesting question waiting just underneath the dramatic one, easier to sit with once the ghosts and the past lives have been set gently aside. If the certainty itself can't be trusted as proof, what is actually happening, physically, in the moments just before and during one of these episodes, deep in the folds of the brain where the feeling is born in the first place? So let's stay with that question a little longer, since it's really the last piece worth turning over before the mind lets this whole subject go. What is happening, physically, in the moments just before and during déjà vu, deep in the folds of the brain where the feeling is actually made? Much of what's known comes from an unusual source, and it's worth pausing on where the evidence actually comes from before trusting it. People with a particular kind of epilepsy, originating in the temporal lobe, sometimes experience déjà vu as an aura, a brief warning sensation that arrives just before a seizure. For decades, neurologists treating these patients noticed the pattern and wrote it down almost in passing, a strange little detail attached to a much more serious condition. But by the 1990s and 2000s, some of these patients were also candidates for surgery. And before surgery, doctors sometimes place electrodes directly onto the surface of the brain, or deep within it, to map exactly where a seizure begins. This is done carefully, for medical reasons, with patients who are awake and able to describe what they're feeling in real time. And what researchers found, when they gently stimulated certain regions with small electrical currents, was remarkable. Touch one particular area, and some patients suddenly said, quietly, almost embarrassed by it, that this has happened before. This exact moment. I've lived this before. The feeling could be switched on and off, not through memory, not through any real repeated experience, but through a small pulse of current in a specific fold of tissue. The region most consistently involved sits in the medial temporal lobe, and specifically it involves structures like the hippocampus and the surrounding cortex, an area often called the parahippocampal gyrus, which sits just beside it. These structures are old, in the evolutionary sense, tucked deep beneath the more recently developed folds of the cortex, and they form what most researchers consider the core machinery of memory. The hippocampus is where new experiences get bound together into something coherent, where a scattered handful of sensations, a smell, a sound, a shape in the corner of the eye, get stitched into a single retrievable moment. And nearby, in the parahippocampal region, sits circuitry that seems to specialize in something slightly different, and, for our purposes, more interesting. A sense of familiarity. Not the content of a memory, not the who or what or when, just the bare feeling that something has been encountered before. It's possible, in other words, for the brain to generate that raw sense of recognition somewhat separately from the actual act of recalling anything specific. The tag can fire without the file it's supposed to be attached to. Sit with that for a moment, because it is, in its own quiet way, the heart of the whole matter. Familiarity and memory are usually so tightly bound together in ordinary experience that it never occurs to most people they might be two different processes running side by side. But under the right conditions, in the temporal lobe of someone about to have a seizure, or perhaps in a briefer, gentler misfire in an otherwise healthy brain, the familiarity signal can apparently switch on by itself. A small flicker in circuitry that usually only lights up when true recognition is warranted, firing now for no traceable reason at all, and the rest of the mind, dutiful as ever, takes that flicker completely at face value. It doesn't ask for supporting evidence. It doesn't check the signal against an actual memory trace before believing it. It simply receives the feeling, this is familiar, and builds everything else around that premise, because that is, after all, exactly what the feeling is for. Under ordinary circumstances, it's supposed to be trustworthy. It usually is. This connects back, gently, to something worth remembering about what the present moment actually is, neurologically speaking. It's easy to imagine that experience is a live broadcast, that a person simply witnesses reality as it happens, moment following moment, in a clean, unbroken line, and that memory is something separate, filed away afterward for later use. But that isn't quite how it works. The felt sense of the present, the specific texture of now, this instant, this room, this exact configuration of sound and light, is itself something the brain constructs, moment by moment, drawing on a huge amount of machinery that also handles memory, prediction, and pattern recognition. There isn't a hard wall between the systems that tell a person what's happening right now and the systems that tell a person what happened before. They overlap. They borrow from each other constantly, which means that when memory circuitry misfires, even briefly, even in a way too small to register as anything but a fleeting feeling, it doesn't just distort the past. It can reach forward and color the present too, because the present was never being generated in total isolation from memory to begin with. That is, in the end, what makes déjà vu genuinely strange, rather than simply annoying or mysterious in some vague, unsatisfying way. It isn't a glitch bolted onto an otherwise separate system. It's a brief, visible seam in something that is usually invisible, a moment where the ordinary, constant, mostly unconscious collaboration between remembering and experiencing shows itself. Just for a second or two, before the seam closes back up and the illusion of a clean, continuous present reasserts itself. Most of the time, this collaboration works so smoothly that a person never has any reason to suspect it's happening at all. The past and the present feel like two entirely separate categories, one gone, one here. Déjà vu is one of the very few moments where the machinery briefly shows through the surface, where the categories blur just long enough to be noticed, and then the moment passes, and the ordinary experience of time reassembles itself, seamless again. There is something almost tender in that, when it's looked at this way. A brain that works hard, constantly, mostly out of view, to give a person the comforting sense that experience is stable, that now is simply now, that the past stays safely in the past where it belongs. It usually does this so well that the effort itself is invisible, and every so often, for reasons that are still not entirely settled, still gently disputed among the researchers who study this, the seam shows, a flicker of familiarity with no memory behind it, a feeling of prediction assembled after the fact rather than before it, a brief, oddly serene sense of having been here, Exactly here, exactly like this, once before. None of it means anything is wrong. For the overwhelming majority of people who experience it, déjà vu isn't a warning sign or a message from anywhere. It's closer to a small, harmless hiccup in a system that is, on the whole, doing an extraordinary job, second by second, stitching together a self, a memory, a sense of time, out of raw sensory noise. It is one of the stranger reminders that a person's experience of reality, however solid and continuous it feels, is being built, actively, quietly, all the time, by machinery tucked deep inside folds of tissue that most people never think about at all. So the next time it happens, if it happens, there's no need to chase it, no need to search the room for a hidden explanation or brace for something significant. It can simply be noticed, the way a person might notice a sudden gust of wind or a particular quality of light through a window in late afternoon. A brief, curious flicker, a seam showing, just for a moment, in something that is usually seamless, and then, as it always does, the feeling fades, the ordinary present settles back into place, and the moment becomes, simply, the next moment, unremarkable again, the way almost every moment is. There is nothing more to solve here tonight, no further thread to pull, just a strange, gentle little quirk of a mind that works tirelessly to make each moment feel whole, occasionally showing, for a second or two, the seams of its own careful work. Let that be enough. Let the thinking soften now, the way it does at the end of a long day, and let whatever comes next simply arrive on its own, unremarkable and easy, the way it usually does. Rest well.